All right, so this is our intro to Realflow for fluid simulations. Um, so the way that once you open Realflow, you get this window here. If you got recently made projects, obviously they'll show up in here. If you're starting this for the first time, that's obviously going to be there's nothing going to be in here. Um, if you want to open a project that's existing, you can hit the browse project here. So if you got sample projects or whatever, you can hit that and it'll take you to a window to go open that. You want to do a new project, you can click over here and then give it a project folder. You can click on this and then you tell it where you want to save that. I'm going to leave it at default. So I'm going to maybe call this one intro. Then you could also hit here to learn, and then you can get all these sample projects that, if you want to see how things are done, you can do that. So we'll just go back to new here, and I want my new project right here. I'm going to create new project, and it's just going to make an empty project. Now I turn my grid off. The shortcut is G. You should have a grid available. So navigation is Maya style navigation. So Alt left mouse button to pan the scene, Alt right mouse to zoom, and Alt middle mouse to what did I say? Did I say rotate? Alt left is rotate, Alt right is zoom, and Alt middle is pan the scene. Okay, so it works just like Maya. If you're familiar with Maya, of course, this should be very easy to jump into. Okay, so this is what we have. This is our interface here, just standard viewport right here. I hit the space bar, got my timeline. So you got a timeline down there. You got a simulate button. So when you have things ready to simulate, you would hit the simulate button to run that simulation. So what we have here is our called relationship editor. It's like a node editor. Basically, you'll get a bunch of nodes when you create stuff in here. So let's start by just having something in the seed. Let's go to geometry, and we'll do a cube that's open on the top. So there's a closed cube and there's an open cube there, as you can see if I zoom in on it right here. And as soon as I create that cube, you see it pops up right in my relationship editor. And then because it's selected, I get all its parameters right here. So simulation active, meaning that if I run a simulation in here, it will participate in that simulation. Dynamics by default is set to no. If I want this thing to get washed away by water or float in a pool or whatever, I would have to turn this on. Right now, the particles and stuff will bump into it, but it's not going to actually be affected itself. So if I needed to be, you could do active rigid body, meaning that it will actually be moved. You can do a passive rigid body, it won't be moved. You can make it a soft body, so it'll be like a squishy object. Okay, oh, select it again. Then we have the position, rotation, and scale. So just like in Maya, these are just your position values. You can place it wherever you need to place it. W, just like Maya, gets your move tool. So I can do that here. You can see that my values change as I do that. E is rotate. So just like in Maya. R is scale. So just like you would if you would be used to in Maya. Then what else is important here? Initial states. Initial states just means that if it's in a certain position caused by dynamics, you can have it just always start in that position. This I use more with the particles themselves. Like if I'm simulating a river, I have to start by pouring water down that river path. And once I have it full and flowing the way I want, I can set that as initial state and then restart my simulation, and it'll start at that state and then simulate from there. Because obviously you don't want your river starting from empty and filling up. You want it to start already full. So that's what initial state is for. Cell size refers to sort of the quality of the simulation. The smaller the cell size, the higher the quality at the expense of simulation time. Okay. I'm not going to go through all these settings here because there's a lot. If you want to know any setting, if you click on it and then hit F1, it'll give you a little sort of synopsis of what it does. And then if you hit more info, it'll actually bring up the help docs, and everything you need to know about what's going on in Realflow is in there. So I'm not going to go through all of them, otherwise we'll be here all day. Just do the sort of important ones. Surface offset is how far your particles need to react with the surface. So you can have them be right up on the surface, or you can have a bit of a gap to account for when you apply the mesh. All this will make sense when we get further into mesh. Volume mode here, shell. You can do solid outside, solid inside. So because this cube right here is an open top cube, meaning that it really doesn't have any volume. It's like a cup basically, and the walls have no thickness, so it's not really a volume. So you would set this to shell. If you were doing, say, a regular cube, let me move it off to the side. This one is a sealed cube, so it's a sealed volume. So you'll see that by default, it's solid on the inside, meaning that no particles can go into the cube because it's a solid chunk it's a solid cube. If you tell it to be solid on the outside, then it assumes that the inside of the cube is hollow, and then everything outside the cube is just a solid volume. So you can only have particles existing on the inside of that cube. Okay, so it's kind of a very useful thing to do, because the problem with simulating things on a shell like this is that depending on your simulation settings, sometimes the particles are moving fast enough that they don't detect the collision with the wall. And with a shell, you're trying to collide with something that's very thin, and you get sort of particle issues when you do that. So having it as a solid inside or outside will give you much better results. When it's a shell like this, you can't really do anything with solid inside because it's not actually a volume. So you got to be careful with simulating things that are just one-sided faces like this. Wet dry texture. So if you want your cube to actually look like it's getting wet, you can generate those textures, which you can then use in your rendering package to make it look like the object is getting wet, is being wet by the particles. Okay, and then pretty much everything up there, everything after that is not quite as important. Okay, so let's do our first simulation, I guess. By the way, right here this is your nodes. So this is like an outliner in Maya. What do we have here? This little rocket right here determines if that simulation is active or not. So when it's green, it's active. You click it and it's orange. That means the simulation's been cached, so it's not going to actually simulate. It's going to read from these saved cache files. And then when you click it again, it becomes inactive. You see that it changed inactive. Red means inactive. So you can selectively activate or deactivate objects or make them cache. This is telling you whether you want it to read or write to the disk. This one here is visibility. So if you click this on and off, you can hide that object. And then this one here is how you display it. You can display it in wireframe. Actually, no, that was, sorry, let's go back. There. That's bounding box, not wireframe. And then here's wireframe, and you click again, you have flat shaded, and you click again, you have smooth shaded. So this is basically softens and normals. So you can do that. The shortcut to do it is D. So if you keep hitting D, it's going to toggle through those modes. Okay, so D will do that for you. And that's per object, right? If you use D, that's for the object selected. If you use, let me see if I remember it. So 0 on the keyboard, it will do it for all of them. So 0 is smooth shaded, 9 is flat shaded, 8 is wireframe, and 7 is bounding box. But that does it for the entire scene. So that's the difference. If you just want it for a single object, it's D. If you want it to happen for all objects, it's 7, 8, 9, and 0. We'll cycle through those modes there. Okay. The different viewports. If you hit 1, you get the top view. 2 is the front view. 3 is the side view, and 4 is back to perspective. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4 will switch through your views. Okay, again, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so top, front, side, and perspective. Okay, then down here you got your messages. Every time you do something, it's got a timestamp. It'll tell you what's happening. Anytime you simulate it, you'll get all kinds of messages down there. And then also, like we had with the active simulation, active cache and disabled in your thing there, that you can control that from here as well. So you don't have to do it there. You can do it from here. And then also the visibility things, you can make something invisible on this button right here and make it visible again there. Then you got your different modes right here, just like you had before. So you could do these things from multiple places. All right, so let's do our first simulation. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to enlarge my open top cube here. Let's delete this guy so we have something to drop some water into. Okay, and let's make it a little bit taller and maybe move it up. And I'm going to use I'm going to hit 2 to get my front view, or you can use 3, the side view, just to make it sitting on the grid here. And then I hit 4 to go back to the cube. Now, if you'll notice, the inner faces of the cube are darker than the outer faces. That's because faces have a direction, right? So the normals are facing outward. So we want to reverse those normals so that the inside of the cube is what's going to react with the water. And the way that you do that is we scroll down here, and normal facing, it's under the display tab here. Normal facing is original. We want to set this to reversed. Now, these are the faces are the right way that we want them. So we want this cube to be inside out. Okay, so now we need something that we can use to drop our particles. I'm going to hit G just to get rid of my grid. I don't really need the grid there anyway. So if you hit G, it'll take care of that. So right here, standard particles. So RealFlow comes with basically three types of particles. The standard particles, called SPH particles. You got hybrido particles, which are more for sort of larger scale simulations. These are voxel based. And then Diverso, which is it's kind of a hybrid between the two, but it's also voxel based, but it's for sort of smaller scale. So the standard particles are the original particles that RealFlow had in its earliest versions. These are very intensive because it tracks every particle, but you get really, really nicely detailed simulations with these. So we're going to start with this. So you got different kinds of emitters here. You get a circle, square, and then a sphere, and there's all kinds of different things. We're going to keep it simple here. We're just going to click on circle. Okay, so what that gives us is this. It's a circle with an arrow pointing out of it. Okay, the arrow shows the direction of the emission of particles. Okay, so what we're going to do here now, obviously, RealFlow is going to use quite a lot of hard drive space on your computer. So make sure that you save your projects into a folder that is big enough. There's enough space on that hard drive for the simulation, because you'd be shocked how many. I've had simulations that have taken up about 3 terabytes. So it can be pretty serious. So, but those are pretty heavy simulations, nothing crazy. Okay, so we have our emitter right here. So now, again, because I have set my I've used this software before. I got my own settings here. So let me just return this back to its original. You should have a hub in there, and I forgot to mention that. So now, where was that? Okay, so you would have something like this. You would have this hub right here, and anytime you create a node, so if I make a sphere, it's automatically going to attach to the hub. So this is the default method that RealFlow uses. And I actually turned this off, but we'll talk about that a little bit later. So by having everything connected to the hub, it means everything is going to react with it's going to, like any particles that you make in there are gonna bump into everything in the scene, which is fine as a starting thing. But I sometimes like to make the connections myself to make sure that things that don't need to interact aren't interacting. Anyway, so we have our hub in here. So let's go back to our emitter right here. So circle 1 is the name of the emitter. Let's look at some of the options here, the parameters. So type is liquid. So there's different types in here. Dumb, elastic, and there's also gas. We're gonna stick with liquid. Resolution is how, is the quality of the simulation. Okay, density, that's the density of water at 1,000. So if you hit F1 with that selected, it tells you exactly what that setting is for. So water tends to be at about 1,000 kilograms per meter squared in density. So if you're making water, you want to leave that at this. If you're making oil or something else, then you probably want to do some research into figuring out what that density of that liquid is in order to get this to look right. Okay, so we're going to leave that there. So internal and external pressure. Um, internal pressure is the forces between particles that's causing them to push each other apart. Um, and then the external pressure uh, is kind of like pressure acting on the particles from outside of the fluid. So, like they say in here, atmospheric pressure type thing. So, generally, as sort of a first simulation, I'm not really going to mess with this. Viscosity, though, I might mess with. Viscosity is how thick a liquid is, essentially. So, if you got honey, it's got a high viscosity versus water. And for me, I don't know. I tend to find that a value of 3 is a little high, so I might even go down to 1 or 1.5. But that's entirely up to you. Surface tension is 1. If you want to do things like droplets that sort of hang there for a minute before dropping off, then you want to turn up your surface tension. Okay, so surface tension. If you've seen water bugs that can walk on the water, that's all because of the surface tension of the water. All right, so max particles it's kind of a random number saying how many particles and it's a really high number. If you want to put limits on how many particles your simulation can make, then you can change this number to whatever you want. But I've never had to change this number. That's a very high number. If you've got that many particles with the standard particle emitters, then you must have a really nice computer, because that is a very high number and it's going to take a lot of processing power with these types of particles. Okay, so we have that then. And if we come down here, circle. So this is the actual parameters of the emitter itself. So this up here is what kind of liquid am I making? That's what you would set here. And then over here, down here at circle, which is the type of emitter, is things like the speed of the emitter. So is it a fire hose? Is it shooting out that liquid really fast? Things like that. So I'm going to leave them at default for right now, and we'll see what we get. So if we hit the simulate button and let this run, and sometimes it might take a second to get started. But there we go right there. So we have some particles coming out. Where'd they go? There we go. And you can see, if I switch to one of the side views here, you can see it's not very realistic. This is not very realistic at all, right? We got layers of particles, which is not good at all. So I'm going to stop my simulation here. This does not, I'm going to hit 4, does not look very good. That's because these particles are emitted per unit of time, whatever that may be. It might be a frame or whatever. And they're just emitted, because this circle is like a disk, it just emits disks of particles as it goes. Not very realistic looking. So what we can do here, H and V random, is sort of, if you turn these values up, and then let's reset. Right, I'm just going to turn these up, and let's see what that looks like now. See, it's trying to put a little bit more randomness in the particle emission, so that it's not looking so computer generated. Okay, so you just turn these up and see what you get. Okay, so that's a little bit better. Generally, what I will tell you is, if you're going to emit particles, then the emission should happen off screen, so you can do things like to improve the look of the water coming out of the emitter. It just, even though my randomness values are up, it's still not looking that great, right? So usually what I'll do, like if I was going to do a fire hydrant, I would have it emit back into the fire hydrant into a wall, and then force the water to sort of bump into the wall and then go back out the front of the hydrant. So that's the way that I would do it, because that would then completely churn up those particles and make them look more realistic. Now, one thing that you always have to keep in mind with any kind of dynamic simulation is scale. So if we come down here, you see it says scale options. So click on that. And right now my geometry scale is set to 1. And my cell size scale is set to 1. So in Realflow, I'm going to bring back my grid. I'm going to make that regular cube again. I'm just going to move it off to the side here. Okay, and then I'm going to come up here to Tools, and I'm going to go to Measure Utility. Okay, so I forget what the default is. Metric. If we leave it in metric, so this cube is, if you look at the surface of the cube, it has a surface area of 6 meters squared. Okay, so that means each side is a meter by a meter. So this is a meter size square. Each side, it's a meter tall, right? So therefore, the surface area is 6 meters squared. So this is a very big cube if you think about it. Okay, if you're trying to make water to fill a cup, well, now you're at a pretty big scale. If we go to American, so that's a 69.59 foot square cube surface area. The volume is 264.2 gallons, right? So this is a pretty big cube, which means if that's that big, then this is huge. This is pretty big. So you saw that my particles were coming out pretty slowly. That's because it thinks I'm doing a very large simulation. So what we could do here is come back to our scale options, and let's do our geometry scale. Let's go 0.1. So now we're at a tenth the size, and look what happens. Everything shrinks down to a tenth the size. RealFlow defaults to meters. Maya defaults to centimeters. So basically, a box in Maya that is a 1x1 cube, which is 1 centimeter. If you look at my distant tool here, because we're default to centimeters in Maya, so centimeters. So that's a 1 centimeter cube. But when you import it into RealFlow, and I'm going to put this back up to 1 here, just so we're back at default settings. Let's go ahead. I'm going to import that box. You can see now this box is the same as that original one, which means it's a 1 meter cube. So again, if we just go ahead and measure this new cube here, you'll see it's got 6 meter squared surface area. Okay, so bear that in mind. Just because something is in centimeters in Maya does not mean that RealFlow is going to see it in centimeters. Now, I exported this as an OBJ. There's 2 different ways you can export. You can do an OBJ or an SD file, which is part of the RealFlow plugin there, but we'll talk about that one later. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so I'm going to then, because I'm working sort of Maya scale, I'm going to cut everything down to 1/10 of its size. So what used to be a meter will now be 10 centimeters. So I can get rid of this guy here. Okay, so now what we're going to do here is then I'm going to reset the simulation. And let's run that again. Now, where did my... Oh, the other thing to note is that the geometry scaled down according to the scale, but your emitter won't. Okay, so the emitter is going to stay the same size. So I actually need to reset this. And I'm going to move this closer and shrink it down. So you're going to have to do this manually. And let's see here. Maybe something like that. You'll see that it looks a lot bigger now, but it should still work. So we shrunk it down. And you'll see now we get fewer particles, right? Because the settings now that showed us quite a few particles before at the higher scale, now we're at such a small scale that's not really doing very much. So we're getting a very small sprinkle of particles. So that's why we got to come up in here and do the resolution. So let me go, let's do a resolution of 10, and let's reset this. And then simulate it again. You'll see we have more particles. Okay. Obviously, the more particles you have, the slower things get. That's still pretty low. Let's do 100. Okay, now we get more. So the more of them you have, the better it's going to look. The secret to really nice looking simulations in RealFlow is having enough particles in there. Usually, if you want to get a really nice simulation, you got to have where you can barely see through the particles. If you can see through the particles like this, it's probably not going to give you a very nice simulation. So I would still go in and do more. Now, this here, because the circle emitter and the cube are both connected to the hub, they're going to react. So those particles have now collided with that box, as you can see. So I'm going to reset this. Now that I'm at the correct sort of scene scale, I can then adjust my actual scale for the object. So maybe if I make this a little bit bigger, and let's move this up here. And if I rotate this around, now the particles are going to be going this way. Watch what happens here. Okay. So the particles are just going to go along the vector of that emitter. There's no gravity in the scene by default. They're just going to keep going in that direction forever. So if you want to have the effect of things like gravity, you have to then add what we call a daemon, D-A-E-M-O-N. So if you go to this tab right here, we can add a daemon. I've heard it pronounced demon, as in like demon. And I've heard some people say daemon, but I think it's supposed to be pronounced demon. But anyway, I guess it doesn't really matter. So the first one is gravity. That's obviously the one that we want. You don't get that by default. So if I turn on gravity, you'll see that it adds a gravity daemon right there, and it hooks it into the hub, right? So there it is right there. And this one you can move. The position of it doesn't matter. It's acting on the entire scene unless you tell it to be bounded, but we're not going to get into that. So let's see what the effect of that is now. So I'm going to hit simulate. I'm going to turn down my particles here just to speed things up here. So let's go to the circle. What are we at? Let's go to a resolution of, say, 50. Okay, let's simulate that now. Okay, you see the particles they get emitted at a certain speed, and eventually gravity takes a hold of them, and they start to fall downward. Okay, so very, very easy, very intuitive thing. You'll see that as they hit the box there, some are going to split this side, some are going to go into the box. The next issue we're going to have to address, so I'm going to stop the simulation here. So we've got gravity working real nice. And the main problem from this point on is that these particles, now that they've sort of gone past the box, they're going to keep falling forever. And the further away the particles get, where they have to still be calculated, it's going to cost you a lot of processing power. So particles that are no longer really part of the simulation, that you don't need to continue to exist, you could either put something there to catch them and hold them, if it was some kind of container, or you put what's called a K-volume daemon. So what this does, if I hit it, it's going to make this box here, and I can scale this box up to encompass my whole scene. You can even use this fit to scene here, which is going to include the gravity here. So I'm just going to shrink this down. So what this box does is, let me go in the front view here. It creates a bounding box where the particles cannot exist outside of that box. Okay, so if I do this, just get it looking okay there. Let's go back to perspective. So now particles can only exist inside that box. So you can see we have some particles from before that were outside of the bounds of that box. If I keep simulating, watch what happens. Immediately they disappear. And you can see that from that point on, any particle that touches this boundary gets killed. Okay, this is how you keep your memory consumption nice and low. You're not having to calculate all those, the particle positions and things like that. So using that K-volume daemon is absolutely life-saving. I would not simulate without it, because sometimes particles, when they bump into stuff, a single particle could get shot off into space that you might not even notice, and it'll start to really bog your simulation down, and you might not know why. So having that kill volume around the scene, as you can see it right here, will make sure that any particles that happen to just bounce off at a, on that trajectory really fast, and that they get killed as soon as they bump into that box. You can also invert the box, so if you want to keep particles alive outside of it and kill everything that's inside of it, you can do that. So if you're trying to drain a pool or something at a certain rate and you want to put a kill volume to do it, you can put a little kill volume down at the bottom of the pool, and have it be inverted. So as the particles all collide with that box, they get killed. You can sort of drain things that way. So, but by default, this is the behavior. And then one that I like to add on top of that is the drag force. Okay, this just adds sort of like drag from the air kind of thing into the simulation. For me anyway, it makes the water feel more real. So that's one that I put there. And I usually just leave these at the default. I don't really need to change any of these. Um, if you want to enable fall off of your gravity or whatever, so that it only operates within a certain range, you can certainly do that. But I've never really done that. But I'm sure there's situations where you could. Okay, so now we have those in there, those demons. Let's talk more about the circle emitter itself. If we come back down here to circle, so you can see that the thing sprays them out, and almost immediately gravity takes a hold of them. So I'm going to reset this. So if we increase the speed, right now it's only at a speed of 2. Let's go to 10, and then simulate that. What we're going to get is the particles are going to go further before that gravity starts to pull them down. And this 10 is actually quite a bit here. So you'll see. But eventually, if I was to let this go, you'd see you get a nice... So it's just like you'd expect. So they're going to hit that kill volume there and get destroyed. But you get the idea. If I make my kill volume here bigger, or I'm just going to disconnect my kill volume for right now. And this is the nice thing about RealFlow. If you do not want things to react to each other, you can just break the links, and then it'll act like they're not even there. So let's run this again now. And select our circle here so we can see it better. And if we let this go, eventually that water is going to start to be knocked downward by gravity. Okay, so obviously the speed, just like in real life, you got a high pressure hose, like a fire hose, that thing is going to go for a while before the water starts to come back down. But if you got really slow oozing a hose or something, the water is going to just fall right away. So it's as you'd expect. Okay, so you can see we're starting to form an arc as we go, and eventually that'll pour down to the earth there. Okay, so that's a really nice attribute here to animate, because you could animate this is for keyframes, what these circles are. So you can animate that increasing and decreasing to simulate certain effects. Okay, so if you're animating someone turning on the hose, as they start to turn on, you can have this number be very low, and as they keep opening the tap more, you can just keep keying that number up to increase the pressure of the emitter. Now what you'll notice, as we were simulating, you can see down in the timeline we get these frames that get colored in. And you can see now, as I play this back, I can actually scrub that simulation. So RealFlow will automatically cache your simulation, meaning that it's going to write files to your hard drive then it's going to read off those files for you to be able to play it back. So if I hit play, I could actually play this back pretty quick. And you'll also notice that because I only got so far with this simulation at the speed of 10, beyond that, if I simulated something else, it goes back to the old one. So these are the files that were saved from that previous simulation. I just didn't overwrite them. So every time I hit simulate, it's going to overwrite the files that are already there, right? And if I don't overwrite all of them, then you'll see what was under there before. So this was the older simulation here, and that's the newer one. So this is the nice thing about RealFlow, is that it will do that for you. That way you can play them back. You can either play them back here in the viewport, but sometimes you're going to have so many particles that you can't really do that. It's just be too slow. There is a playback option here, and you can do an OpenGL preview, which acts just like a Playblast in Maya. If you remember how to do that, that's the same thing here. So it'll play back what's on the thing. It'll just take a while to cache it and then play it back for you. Okay, so that is your standard particles. Those are the emitters. They're pretty straightforward, square, sphere. It's just the shape that they emit from. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and just delete that, and then reset this. So notice that when I reset, if I want to then bring back those frames, I can just click on a button, and now it's gone because I deleted a thing, but this button here will bring those frames back. Let's look at a different type of emitter. Let's look at a diverso. Okay, so diverso is a little bit different. You need to have a domain. Okay, so there's a DOI domain, diverso domain. So the domain is where all the attributes of the liquid are going to be put. Your resolution, your density again, internal and external pressure again, surface tension, all this stuff is in here. So this is where you would set that stuff, not in the emitter like we did in the previous one. And then you can make your emitter. So this time let's go with a sphere emitter. Okay, so there's the emitter. Notice that the emitter is connected to the domain, not to the hub. Okay, so the emitter is where you see how we have much fewer attributes. Speed and randomness. That's about it. And then you can fill the sphere so that, like, if I turn that on, you'll see that I start with particles in there, and if I don't, you don't. Okay, so speed, we can turn this up, say, I don't know, 3. And I'm gonna shrink down my emitter because it's a little on the big side. Again, we can even scale this up just because to give us a little bit more room here. And I'm gonna, again, it's still disconnected, so I'm not gonna worry about that for right now. In fact, I'm gonna come over here just to hide it. Okay, so here's our emitter. It's a sphere. Now you can't tell that there's no arrow as to which direction everything's going, right? So let's go ahead and simulate this. No, I think I hit it twice. Let's give it a second here. And hope we're not crashing, which is likely. But we'll see here. Let's give it a little bit. Okay, we're back. It did not crash, but it did take a second there. Okay, so we're back here. We want to simulate the diverso. So one thing that you might actually, which will actually help you speed up your simulation. So if you go here to File, you go to Preferences, and then come to Simulation and pick diverso. If you have a CUDA enabled graphics card, turn on Use CUDA, and then usually you have one. I actually have 2 in here, so I actually have 2 of the same card. So I just have it use one of those cards, and that'll actually accelerate your simulations. If you have an OpenCL enabled card, you can do that up here. I believe those are the Radeon cards, I think. And then the other one is also is Hybrido. That's the other one we haven't gotten to yet. That one uses OpenCL if you have it. Unfortunately, it does not use CUDA, but Diverso does like CUDA very much. So this will definitely speed your simulation up. Okay, so make sure you enable that if you do have that. And then, while we're in here, let's go ahead and set some things. So I believe the minimum substeps usually is like 1 or something to 300. So I'll usually turn mine up, and maybe let's speed things up. Let's go 25 to 125. So substeps is how many times per frame the simulation is run. It's not run once per frame. It's run a few times per frame, depending on what you set. And this allows for much more accurate simulation. Your FPS output, I think it defaults to 30. I set mine to 24, and the only reason I do that is because Maya defaults to 24 as well. At least that's what I work in Maya. So to avoid any sort of mismatches in frame rate, I just set mine to 24 FPS output. And then I tell it to use the maximum threads. I have 64 threads in this system, so it's going to use all of them. But you can turn this off and tell it how many to use. If you got, you need to use one of your cores for something else, you can do that. But I just tell it to use max threads. Then while we're also in here, let's go down to display and display info. By default, I think it's set to all nodes. I set it to selected nodes. And what that is, if I hit OK here, is anything that I have selected gets shown here. Now, if you don't have it, if you set it to all nodes, pretty much everything in your scene, it's going to be a long green list of stuff here, and that tends to be distracting. So I just set it to selected nodes. So that's under Preferences, Display, and I set this to selected nodes. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of stuff in here that you can play with. I would not mess with too much stuff until you know what you're doing. Things like notify. This is really nice. If you wanted to notify you every time it gets to a certain point in the simulation, you can do that here. Turn it to active, give it your email address, and tell it how many frames. So if you want to be notified every 10 or 20 or 100 frames, you can put that in there. And it'll send you an email saying it's reached 100 frames. Because sometimes these simulations can take a long time. I did a simulation probably close to 10 years ago now that took a total of 500 hours. So you can imagine that you're not going to sit there and watch it. So just to make sure that the thing is still running, you could tell it to update you at every so often, so you don't have to physically go check on it. So that's a really nice thing. But there's all kinds of other options in here, but let's stick with those for right now. Okay, so now that we have our options set, we've told it to use the video card to run the diverso. We're going to hit simulate, and you'll see what we get here with the diverso. Now notice how much faster this is than the other one. And you can see that as it goes, it's going to just fill up our cube here. And eventually, and what you'll notice there's a gap between the walls of the cube and the actual simulation. And then as we get to the top of the cube, things spill out. Now we still have our kill volume disconnected. So in order to kill those particles there, I would just attach this. And if I keep hitting simulate, that's what I get. Now I've hit my 200 frame limit here. You can always increase these numbers to whatever you need. And again, because it cached everything, look at how quickly that runs. Now obviously this is not, the reason that it comes out that way is because when you're emitting from a sphere, it shoots out in all directions, but then the gravity is bringing it down. So let's go ahead and reset. And you might want to save on a regular basis here because this does tend to crash. So let's get rid of this emitter. And I'm going to select this emitter here and then come over here and do a circle. So by selecting the emitter, I make sure that it automatically attaches it. You'll notice now with the circle emitter, it's very similar to the ones for the standard particle circle emitter. So let's do the same thing again. You'll notice that it actually looks almost identical with the circle with the arrow. Now you have an actual direction, right? And so now for some reason, every time I make a new emitter, this is a quirk of the system here. This might not happen with you. You can see with mine, they just sort of sit there. I'm going to reset this. And I'm going to come here, this little simulate button, click on there, go to options. And what I've found that I have to do is just select the other video card. I got two in here, so this is, and then sometimes we'll crash. So I'll be right back. Okay, and we're back again. So this is what should have been happening. Okay, now again, as you saw before with the other emitter, because these particles have no random in V&H, you get this sort of discs that don't look real at all. And once you mesh this out, it's going to look so bad. It's going to look very CG. So you want to make sure you turn up the V&H random here. Let's reset this and run it again. That's a little bit better. And the more particles you have, the better it's going to look. Okay, so always set that V&H random to work. Okay, so that's what we have here. Now, that little offset from the side walls of the cube is because well, for one thing, we're at a lower sort of resolution here, let's see, on the domain here. The resolution is pretty low. The other thing is to allow for the mesh. So the way particle meshing works is that it'll sort of encase the particles in a mesh, and that mesh will be bigger than the particles. So if you want your fluid to look like it's touching the walls, you want to give a little bit of space there from the particles so that the mesh will fill that and it'll feel like it's actually touching the walls. Okay, so that's why that's there. So that is our diverso. And like I said, always save. Again, you got a whole bunch of different things here. So from here, then we can go to the hybrido particles. So I'm going to get rid of the diverso nodes here. Matter of fact, let's go ahead and just get rid of let's get rid of all this stuff and leave the demons in there. Okay, so let's go to hybrido. So hybrido is designed for large scale stuff. If you want to make a beach, or something with a lot of water, like over a large scale, hybrido is designed for that. So this is what you would use. Diverso probably you would sort of go from small to medium scale, and the standard particles are really good for the smaller scale stuff, maybe some medium scale stuff. But if you want like big bodies of water, hybrido is the way that you want to go. Okay, so there's two different kinds of domains here. You can do an open domain, so you get your hub, because I deleted that. So there's your domain, signified by this green box right here. Then you need an emitter, and the way this works is that hybrido emits from an object. So if I go to my geometry here and say, let's use a cylinder. So I have my cylinder right there. Scale this up a little bit. Okay, so there's my cylinder. So this will be my emitter. So what I'm going to do then is make an emitter. So I'm going to select the domain, come up here to Hybrido and say emitter, and then it's going to ask me to select an element. So it's going to ask me what to use as my emitter, and I'm going to use that cylinder and hit OK. So immediately you'll see that now it puts this green sort of locator in the cylinder, telling me that that is going to be my emitter. So anywhere that I take my cylinder, that green locator goes with it. Okay. What I like to do here is, so that I'm not seeing the actual cylinder, because I really don't need to see it, I'm going to hit D until I get to either bounding box or just wireframe. Okay, so there's my emitter there. And then I can attach my gravity and my kill volume and my drag force to the simulation. Make sure that that is inside of the kill volume. Otherwise, what's going to happen is that you're going to hit simulate and you're going to get nothing. Okay, so keep that in mind. All right, so if we hit simulate, and it might take a second here. This one is not being accelerated by my video card because I do not have an OpenCL video card. So this is all CPU, and you'll see that it's much slower. And I just, hold on, let me stop it so I can get back on my scene here. You can actually see some particles. Now it's a very low resolution simulation here, so those particles are not, there's not that many of them. So the way that you increase your resolution on a hybrido is the cell size, because this is based on voxels, right? It's not looking at individual particles, it's looking at voxels, like volume pixel basically. So right now we're pretty low here. So to increase your particle count, you have to decrease the cell size. So let's go to 0.1 and let's reset this. And let's let it run here for a second. Hope it doesn't crash on us. And we should get more particles, so you can see you have more. So you just got to keep decreasing this. Now, we're working at a very small scale here. I don't think I changed it back. Let me just make sure here. So I'm going to stop my sim. And you can see that this one takes a while even just to stop. So I'm going to reset it. And let's go in here. So we're still at 0.1. I'm going to go back to 1 because, again, Hybrido is designed for large-scale simulations. When I did that, everything got enlarged, but of course my demons did not. And the only one that really have to worry about is our volume demon here. So we've got to make sure that everything is inside of there. And now, if I run this at a 0.1, it's probably going to take quite a bit longer now because everything is bigger. So I'm going to save my file here, then hit simulate, and just give it a minute here to run. Yeah, and as you can see, at a 0.1, what was it, a 0.1? It's not going to let me do it till it's done here. So it's going to start to take much longer. Okay, I'm going to pause the video and get back when it's there. Okay, so this is what it did now. You can see now we got a very dense cloud of particles, and you can see if you select your domain here, it'll tell you exactly how many particles you have. I've got over 1.2 million particles, which is honestly not that many. I've done hybrido simulations up in the 15 to 20 million particles, so it is designed for large-scale things. So you might want to, if you are going to use hybrido, you might want to work at the full-scale geometry scale. Okay, so that is the hybrido. So standard particles, these are sort of legacy particles. They're sort of older. I don't know, honestly, if people really use them much anymore. You get really nice detail if you turn them up, but they are very costly in terms of simulation times because every single particle is tracked individually and all their collisions have to be tracked and everything else. It's a very, you get nice detail, but man, it takes a while to simulate. Diverso has sort of taken over from that because it's I believe it still uses the voxel style simulation, so it's a little bit more efficient. And then of course hybrido, which is made for big large scale simulations. And there's even what we call secondary, so you can generate splashes and foam. So just like ocean foam that you see when the waves crash, you can generate that by turning on foam here. You can generate splashes, so when the fluid bumps up against, splash up against a rock, you can generate splashes. Now those splashes are made up of standard particles, so it's like a combination between the two. Same with the foam and even bubbles. So it's actually a pretty cool system that you can play with. Okay, so that is what we do here. So the next thing you might want to do is import stuff from Maya. So I'm going to show you that there's like I said before, there's two different ways that you can go about importing objects into RealFlow, and I'm going to show you those in a sec.